We're here today to talk a little bit about sideloaded apps and alternative app stores and the impact of the EU DMA. My name is George McGregor and I work for Approov. I'm joined today by John Bronner, who's the lead for the solutions engineering at PreEmptive, which is a partner of ours. And we're both going to take you through this set of presentation here today to talk a little bit about the DMA and the impact and the steps that developers should take to protect their apps. So we're going to work through some topics. We'll start with what the DMA is and its impact and how we think it will evolve. Then we'll cover the risks to mobile apps in this new environment. We'll talk a little bit about the overall issues with the current Apple and Google security for mobile apps. And then we'll introduce our solution, which is really a defense in depth approach to making sure that you've got security all the way from the source code to the running app. We'll have a short conclusion for the next steps for developers, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So that's the way it's going to run, and we'll get started right away with the first part, which is talking about the EU DMA and its impact. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with what's happening here, but basically the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, was introduced, came into effect in March the 7th this year, and it imposes a set of obligations and restrictions on the tech giants, including Apple, Google, Amazon, ByteDance, and Meta. And it's really intended to create more competition in European markets and prevent large companies like Apple and Google from abusing their market power. So it has very good aims, and it's a big opportunity. So explicitly in the mobile space, the thing that we are interested in today is that it requires Apple and Google to enable alternative app stores and side-loaded apps and alternative payment mechanisms. So these are really big things that are required of Google and Apple. Google already allow these things, so and they've made some tweaks in response to the DMA, but Apple is really the major area where obviously this was an issue, and they had to have a very detailed response. And they provided a detailed and complex response, which included a new fee structure and all sorts of new approaches to enabling this, and they claim that they're now compliant with the EU DMA. But this approach has been heavily criticized by their peers. So, for example, Meta and other large players. And also the EU has initiated a non-compliance review with Apple, in particular about the fee structure that Apple are proposing. So, you may be thinking, well, if you're not in Europe, this doesn't matter. Well, it really does, because it's part of a much bigger worldwide trend to hold the likes of Google and Apple accountable. There's things like the Epic Games and Spotify lawsuits. The Department of Justice in the US has initiated anti-monopoly action against Apple, and countries around the world are looking at similar things to the DMA to try to hold the large tech giants accountable. So this is part of a big trend, and really we need to pay attention to it. So with respect to security, this is not something that has been widely discussed, but there are some important things here. Apple, in particular, has been quite resistant to the DMA because of concerns about security and privacy. And the fact is that the Apple and Google security that they provide for mobile apps is really heavily tied with the App Store and the Play ecosystems. So Apple, says that the new options open new avenues for malware, fraud, and scams, and so they are, I would say, very, very resistant to the DMA, but they claim that they've responded to it. But as a side effect, the security is an issue. In fact, here's what Kyle Andier, who's the VP of Products and Regulatory Law at Apple, says at an EU hearing. And I'll just let you listen to this.
I will say, the proof is kind of in some of those studies we've seen. I mean, there's a suggestion that somehow our platform doesn't appear on the top most secure platforms. I guess I haven't seen those studies. Every study I've seen has said iPhone is the most secure, is the most safe mobile device or computing device in the marketplace. That's consistent over and over and over again. We have not had to offer third-party or first-party security services or applications on iPhone because it's built in. It is intended to be as secure as possible. Now we're entering a world where there's going to be less security. So ironically enough, users may have to pay for additional security from third parties. We'll see what happens. But to date, that hasn't had to happen because we've delivered on that promise year after year after year.
So I think that kind of sums up the somewhat passive-aggressive response to the DMA from Apple. And I think that, you know, it's time really for us to take a look outside of the Apple walled garden, if you like. The trends are, you know, going in that direction, and it's really important for people to think differently in terms of securing your apps. So the response, of course, to Apple's proposal was quite swift and negative. You can see here some of the examples. So this brings us to a first polling question which we have for the audience today. What would you say would be a fair commission to pay Apple and Google for the App Store and the Play Store? So just let you fill in the answer here. You know, the choices are 0, which is what the case in the Mac environment or in the desktop environment, 5 to 10%, or the current model 20 to 30%. You can take your pick here. It doesn't look like anybody's very happy with the current model, is the conclusion. All right, so moving on. Let's go back to the presentation here. And how will this evolve? Well, I think it will take some time for the dust to settle here. It's going to take years, in fact. But it's pretty clear that the EU is resolved to break the monopoly behavior of the large players. And sideloaded apps and alternative app stores are going to happen no matter what happens. And this is going to be a worldwide trend. So it's also true that the security is going to be limited. And as we will see, we'll look a little closer at the Apple and Google security and how that works. It's not going to work well for sideloaded apps. It's also true that there are much more, you know, there are other things. It's not just a world which Google and Apple are playing. There's also Harmony OS. There are other platforms and other players. We think we will see large, you know, game providers providing alternative app stores. And the whole thing about this is going to mean a shift to API protection, because even if you are not planning to have sideloaded apps, you will be having copies of your apps that are available, and there will be the risk of cloning apps and apps being available in other forms that are going to attack your APIs. So there's a whole shift to API protection that's going to be very important here. So in conclusion, mobile app providers really need to make no assumptions about how your apps are going to be distributed and where they're going to end up. And you need to urgently seek alternative security approaches. So let's move on and really talk a little bit about the fundamental requirements for application security. So key things to understand about this new world is that app code can still be reverse engineered, and that's just a fundamental basic fact of mobile apps and the way they are developed and built. And also those apps will run in a client environment which is open to hackers and is not owned by you or by the App Store owner or by anyone else. It's really open for anyone to get access to. So these are the key things that we have to take a look at. And what we're going to do now is just dig in a little bit and look at what's required to protect each of these. I'm going to hand over to John at this point and let him talk a little bit about protecting app code.
All right, thanks, George. So when organizations think about securing their application portfolio, they're typically concerned about injection attacks, cross-site scripting, server-side request forgery, and the myriad of other attacks that occur by way of malicious input provided by the end user. But quite a few organizations, what we found is that they're unaware of the threat of reverse engineering as a technique that is employed by hackers. For most of the major programming languages in use today, there are decompilers and or disassemblers available. On top of that, there are code formatters, debuggers, dynamic code instrumentation, and other similar tools that are leveraged by hackers for reverse engineering. Many of these tools are free, and several are open source even. And there's been a proliferation of this type of tooling over the years. That's just expanded. And when we're deploying our apps to an unsecured environment, be it cloud, desktop browser, or mobile, it could be almost the equivalent of handing out our source code if we're not taking the appropriate steps. So with nothing more than deployed binaries or apps distributables, hackers can do everything from stealing intellectual property or trade secrets to probing for vulnerabilities in order to launch a data breach, bypassing software checks like logins and license keys, repackaging attacks, malware injection, and much, much more. So while each and every app has a different risk profile, regardless of the platform or technology used, there is a threat of reverse engineering. And we should always assume that whatever we're deploying, the source code can be extracted from our distributables. And that's just the nature of app development. We must also consider compliance when we're establishing our mobile AppSec programs. So for example, if our organization accepts credit card payments through our apps, we must adhere to PCI DSS, that's just the way it is. So this will yield very specific requirements for application hardening and encryption of credit card data. Proper compliance is a requirement for operating in most industries and sectors. It'll be different for education, manufacturing, that sort of thing, but it's a requirement. And if we don't, then we will risk heavy fines, penalties, and worse. So this, in and of itself, should be considered a material risk to our operations. And it's best to establish good mitigating controls for such risk factors as reverse engineering, man-in-the-middle attacks, running in untrusted environments. It's best to establish these mitigating controls in the beginning because, in this webinar, we've been talking about the DMA. But we've been through this before: Defense of Trade Secrets Act, GDPR, President's Cybersecurity Executive Order in 2021. We will most certainly go through it again. The laws, regulations, the rules of the games are always going to change. But by establishing mitigating controls at the start, having things in place, when a new regulation or rule comes about, we just have to make slight tweaks to our process, little adjustments here and there, if anything, rather than trying to scramble and come up with something wholesale from the ground up. So that's just a little bit about how compliance comes into the equation. So we can go to the next slide, please, George.
Okay, so John, we have a polling question there. Do you want to do that? Code
yes.
protection? Okay, so let me run that. So what types of code protection do you use today? So John, you can give some background on this one if you like, but people can answer the question. It's either commercial. Yeah.
We're just, do you have any sort of commercial code protection in place through a third-party vendor? We're using something open source, one of the open source available tooling to protect our binaries. We're doing no code protection, or we don't know, or we don't want to say. It's perfectly fine. If you wouldn't mind submitting.
So we've had a few responses. Let's see. Let's share the results. See how you interpret that.
Great. So looks like quite a few of us have engaged commercial code protection. So that's great to hear.
Okay. So let's go on and look at the runtime environment. So once your app is out in the wild, could be anywhere, it's going to be running on a device, and it's going to be communicating with your backend, and it's probably going to be communicating with third-party APIs for the services that you use in the app. So this is the way we think about the attack surfaces that attackers can potentially target. So it's quite a simple picture, but there's a lot to say about this. So the first thing is user credentials. Obviously, there are lots of best practices around this. You can use frameworks like OAuth 2, etc. You can use two-factor authentication, but there's still opportunities. There's, people's credentials and email addresses and passwords are available on the dark web. Every day there seems to be a large-scale breach. So people have access to credentials and they can employ them. It's much easier if some of these other attack surfaces are exposed, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But still, there's a real risk there, and that should be an area of focus. The second piece here is to actually do with what's going on in the device itself, and there's two things. One is that the app integrity itself and the device integrity. So the app integrity is to do with things like app attestation. So at runtime, you want to be able to check that the app has not been modified or cloned or copied or interfered with in any way. And there are tools in place to be able to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. You want to be able to make sure that people are not, accessing your backend via scripts or automated mechanisms to try to pretend to be your app. And then the second piece here, and number three, is the device integrity. So obviously, rooted and jailbroken devices pose a risk to security because the security inbuilt mechanisms are then compromised. But there are automation frameworks, instrumentation frameworks that can be used to hook into key functions at runtime and can produce completely different app behavior. So, diverting ad revenue, interfering with the function, cheating at games, all of these things are things that can be done with frameworks that are installed in the client device and interfere with the way that the app operates. So you really have to be able to get visibility to what's going on there and get some level of control over it. The fourth attack surface here is the channel between the app and the back-end services. And this is a particular problem in the mobile environment because even if you're using HTTPS and you're using strong encryption on the channel, because the attackers have access to the device, they can interfere with the trust store, and they can use tools like FRIDA or MITM proxy to effectively carry out a man-in-the-middle attack. So this is a very important channel. People, attackers can use this to grab keys or find out, explore how the API functions. And then finally, the API itself, we mentioned that earlier on. You've got to be thinking about what could be accessing this. It's not enough to depend on user credentials. You have to be able to understand basically if it's a genuine app and it's in an untampered environment. And you need to do that check all the time. You need to be doing it continuously and real time. Attackers can attack your APIs to steal data. We've seen plenty of examples of that taking place, but they can also set up DDoS attacks and take out your service. And that can be a real issue with third-party services, for example, that you're employing, especially if you have quotas or you have some constraints, or even if you're paying for the service, that can be a real issue. And then what an attacker does is they don't just use one of these. They will be cycling through from these attack surfaces. They will be trying to get information and use that information to then basically target your APIs and your application to try to get useful information or to divert the function of the app. So there's all sorts of things can go wrong at runtime as well. And so really, that's kind of our key point here, key message here is to create that kind of defense in depth strategy and think about protecting your code, but also think about the environment that the app will be running in and protect that. So we just wanted to make a few comments about the frameworks and tools that are available. You don't need to make all this up. There's plenty of stuff that can be used as a framework and is directly applicable to mobile app security. The premier set of resources, of course, is from OWASP, and the mobile top 10 has just been published. So this is a real snapshot of the key risks right now. You can see the list here on the left. And OWASP MASVS, the mobile application security framework, there's a vast amount of information and resources. There's the testing guide for pen testing. And there's this was revised substantially last year, so this is really very much up to date as well. And then finally, the framework that both John and I are very keen on is the NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework. And this is very important because it talks about a life cycle. It's not just about protection or doing things once, but thinking through all the way through from the beginning of your project all the way through to the deployment. And even more importantly, what goes wrong, what happens if things go wrong? What happens if there is a breach? How do you recover from it? This is something that we've seen with quite, some recent breaches that people have been quite ill prepared. They haven't been really thinking through what it is that they need to do when things do go wrong. So this is a great framework. So all of these three things together are really things that your developers should be very familiar with, and you should be implementing across your organization. And we'll refer back to some elements of this as we go through the presentation. So let's talk a little bit about the overall limitations of Apple and Google security as it stands. So even in a perfect world, if we could depend on Apple and Google, and there weren't other platforms and and other app stores, there are still some restrictions in the way that they protect applications, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So first up, John, you're going to talk a little bit about the protection of intellectual property and how both platforms approach that.
Yes, thanks, George. So both the App Store and the Google Play Store have a formal review and approval process prior to publishing. Both will involve some combination of manual and automated reviews. The primary aim of this review process from a security standpoint is to root out malware or infected code for publishing to their store, and also obviously to uncover violations to the App Store policies, no hate speech, no copyright infringements, and also to ensure that the end user privacy regulations are followed. The different rules and regulations around the end users, PII, and that sort of thing, personal information. Both app stores will require signing of apps with a digital certificate prior to publishing. App Store has a little bit more tight control on that, but Google has a little bit more leniency in terms of the certificates. But all this being said, none of this will actually do anything to prevent decompilation, disassembly, and reverse engineering of the mobile apps. There are slight differences between the two, notable differences. Historically, Apple is a little bit more stringent in terms of their publishing process and a little bit more rigorous in terms of security. And when it comes to Google, the Google Play Store apps are natively written in Java and or Kotlin. And these are managed languages which compile to an intermediate language called bytecode in order to run on a platform. Java famously wrote write once, run anywhere. So the idea was that you can compile without needing to compile to a specific CPU architecture or OS. And the JVM virtual machine layer will interpret all those for the particular OS. In the case of Android, the bytecode is translated to Dalvik DEX, or more recently, the Android Runtime. The side effect of running on a managed language is that it is very easy to decompile, very easy to reverse engineer, and very easy to reconstruct the high-level source code, almost one-to-one. So we'll see that a little bit later. The App Store, Apple has historically had, like I said, a more rigorous review and publish process, but nevertheless, they're still prone to reverse engineering once the apps get out there. They will encrypt the binaries, so they will apply some encryption, but that is, again, using free tooling, very easy to decrypt the binaries once we get access to them, jailbreak a device, use Frida, so it's possible to decrypt. The App Store apps are also natively written in Objective-C and Swift. These languages are inherently harder to decompile than Java or Kotlin, but it still can be done. So the apps are disassembled back to assembly level instructions. There are certain decompilers that will render almost high level source. It'll be closer to pseudocode. It will not be a neat, exact one-to-one full source code decompilation, but it'll still potentially reveal keys, API endpoints, stuff like that if, when decompiling happens. Just the tool chain itself with Clang, LLVM, bitcode, now bitcode being deprecated, it's just historically been a little bit harder to reverse engineer. But bottom line being, Apple and Google are both considering security when they're publishing apps to their app store. But primarily the aim is to prevent malware and viruses from making their way into their apps and their environment. And they're also concerned about end user privacy guidelines. Nevertheless, the apps can be reverse engineered. And then, bottom line being that with the EU DMA getting into effect and the proliferation of the alternative app stores and sideloaded apps and whatnot, it just simply means that we no longer always benefit from what approval process there is in place. And that just makes the environments that our apps will live in more dangerous. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, George.
Thanks, John. So let's talk a little bit about the runtime protection. So we'll talk a little bit about Google, and then we'll talk about Apple. But on the Google side, there is the Play Integrity API, which was announced in 2021. And of course, these are available to app developers as part of the tax, if you like. So they're in principle free, but they're part of the ecosystem. So Google Play Integrity is Android only, of course, and it does need Play services to run. So it doesn't work with AOSP loads or different kinds of apps in different environments. The device checks are limited. The API provides what it calls an integrity verdict, which is really, kind of virtual, basic, and strong in terms of the checking of the client environment. So it's not very granular. And then again, feedback, this is slow and complex to implement. And developers in particular have to, change all the API calls and defend them at a function level, meaning that nothing's really protected immediately. And, you need to review all of the API call points and make modifications to many of them. So it is a little complex to put in place. And again, it only works on Android. There's no man-in-the-middle protection, and there's no way, there's nothing that protects your secrets at runtime. Although, of course, Google has a tool for secret management. If we look at the Apple side, the solutions are device check and app attest. So again, the app attest part, or device check, was really set up to try to stop people from claiming special offers twice, effectively. And then app attest was added to try to give some level of protection or app attestation to the solution. Again, these are included. Again, iOS only, of course. The device checks are again, pretty limited and not very transparent. But basically, if the device is jailbroken, this won't work. The analytics are very limited. And actually, both of these solutions have kind of rate limits and performance limitations, which are, again, not very transparent and quite frustrating for developers. This, again, is very complex to implement. In fact, there's like something like a 9-step explanation of how you check at the back end to verify if the environment is safe and if the app is attested. And again, there's no man-in-the-middle protection or dynamic secrets protection provided by the solution. So again, John, this is kind of we thought we would like chat a little bit about this as well. But we talked about some of the technical challenges of the Apple and Google and security approaches, but the big picture, or the elephant in the room, or whatever, is not that. It's really there's some other things that are important. So we're in a world now of cross-platform development tools because people are trying to manage the costs of development. We have new platforms coming up, as we mentioned, and it's very complex and very costly having different security approaches for different platforms. And this is only going to get worse. So I don't know, John, if you have a comment on the multi-platform support piece. But I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was really just going to say the environment has evolved so much, kind of over the past handful of years or several years, however you want to take it, and the tooling around it has changed. When we started, we were building Android apps in Android Studio, or excuse me, in Eclipse, and and we could only build iOS apps in Xcode, and now we can use Visual Studio, we can use IntelliJ, Android Studio. There's all these different tools, and everything is cross-platform. But the bottom line, I think, in all this is that Apple and Google, their primary goal is to attract more application developers and attract more organizations to using their platform so that they can grow and expand those platforms and return to investors. And that's good. That's good for them. That's proper for them. They're not a security company. They offer privacy reviews because that's required by law, regulations, and they'll get their hands smacked if they don't. They offer virus scans because they don't want a polluted environment and all that sort of stuff. But security is important to both, to Apple, Google, and Microsoft. That it's very, very important. I'm not saying it's not, but they're not security companies in that aspect.
Yeah.
They're just trying to grow and attract as many people as they can. And so if they're going to offer security, they're going to offer something that they can sell for their solution. And that's so when working with third party vendors like Approov and PreEmptive, we're concerned with security first and foremost. We want to secure all of your apps. We want to secure your APIs, your backends. We don't want man in the middle to happen. Let's say you built an API that now you want to have a desktop app using that API, or you want to build a web in browser thing and use that API. Well, if you're only relying on what the App Store provides you, then you have to look for something else to do that. So
yeah, and then something else that's been raised as a concern is that the innovation is not aided by this financial model that Google and Apple have in place, where the kind of good enough security is bundled with their offering, and you pay for it whether you like it or not. This is not a healthy market, and the DOJ in particular that has pointed that out, and that's one of the objectives that they have, is to try to stimulate a much more lively market where there's a lot of innovation, and it's much better for the industry overall. Okay, so enough on that. Let's talk a little bit about the solution to some of these issues, and we're going to dive in here and talk about the PreEmptive and the Approov solutions. So, John, over to you again.
All right, thanks, George. So, how can we protect the apps we're building against this very real threat of reverse engineering and tampering? So PreEmptive provides a multi-layer approach to code protection. So we have transforms such as rename obfuscation, control flow obfuscation, and watermarking, which cloak the binaries from source code extraction while remaining semantically and syntactically equivalent to the runtime environment. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, George, please.
Yep, hang
on. So just an example, on the left-hand side here, we see a sample of a method that has been run through a free, the one previous.
Sorry, oops, there we go.
That's all. Thank you. So what we're seeing here is an example of a method that has been run through a free decompiler tool. So we have the validate method, which is responsible for our time locking / licensing mechanism. It's a homegrown thing we built. So if a hacker, as soon as they gain access to our binary, be it APK, IPA, DLL, executable, jar file, what have you, the hacker can load this up in the decompiler, focus all her efforts on honing into and bypassing this little bit of licensing code. And then boom, they've bypassed your homegrown licensing algorithm. Or maybe it's another key bit of IP or a trade secret or something else that's embedded within the binary. The hacker, on the right-hand side, what we see is an example of obfuscated code. So the process of obfuscation, it destroys code patterns that are easily understandable by humans while remaining semantically and syntactically equivalent to the original code. The runtime does not care if the method is called validate or if it's called A. It's going to still execute the same series of instructions. If you wouldn't mind hitting the next slide, please, George. And then in addition, we're layering on client-side, in addition to the code obfuscation binary shielding, we're layering on client-side tamper defense, debug defense, root jailbreak detection. These attacks occur on the running app or are threats to the environment. Depending on the context, there are also client-side checks such as DevTools blocking, domain locking if we're running in browser, for example. And something I wanted to mention about this, because we're talking about defense in depth, our code all runs client side. So all we're doing is we're embedding this in the binary, and then we have a couple canned responses, or we expose a Boolean for you. We don't have the real-time threat detection analytics, the real-time monitoring. So this is one of the several reasons why we we fit well with the Approov solution. So we complement each other very, very well with this. If you wouldn't mind hitting the next slide, George. And then finally, PreEmptive runs on-prem and can be integrated into any build via command line, MS Build, Azure DevOps, or IDEs like Visual Studio, Visual Studio Mac. Protections are applied at the binary level, embedded within the distributable. There's no additional hardware, software library, or dependencies that are introduced or needed. PreEmptive, we started back in 1996, so almost 30 years ago. We were focused exclusively on Java technologies and desktop and Java EE and that sort of thing at the time. Since 2003, we've shipped a lightweight version of our .NET obfuscation tool in every version of Visual Studio. PreEmptive's obfuscator is the only software component embedded inside Visual Studio that is not directly developed by Microsoft. So with our unique relationship with Microsoft, that makes us the de facto standard for defense against reverse engineering and tampering on the .NET platform. We also support a myriad of other technologies: Java, Android, iOS, Angular, React Native, Xamarin, Maui, and much more. And again, as I mentioned, our solution blends perfectly well with Android's monitoring, real-time API protection, man-in-the-middle protection, threat detection, and analytics. So I'll hand it back to you, George. Go to the next.
Yep. So I need to go. So yeah. So so we've seen that runtime protection is important, and attackers don't just confine themselves to analyzing the code. So can you trust the integrity of your application at runtime is the key thing. And what Approov does is it basically ensures that only an untampered, genuine mobile app running in a completely uncompromised environment can actually access your backend. And that means that you get protection from any kind of at-scale attacks, and also protects you from unknown vulnerabilities in your APIs. And the way it does this is the kind of a patented and very unique approach, which means that decisions are not made in the app itself or in the device, but there's an interaction between a cloud service, which you see on the left-hand side here, and the running app, which ensures that the protection and security of the solution. So there's nothing that attacker can tamper with in the device. And basically what happens is that the first step is you install the Approov SDK. You need to integrate that with your app. And we have quick starts for all of the tools and development environments that we've mentioned here. And the way it's integrated is you don't need to modify the API calls. That's taken care of. But basically there's a check each time there's a request to the back end. And the Approov SDK checks two things. It will check it will do the app attestation, and it will also check the device environment. So you register your app before you put it in the App Store or before it's deployed, and Approov takes a fingerprint of the app and uses that to validate the app is genuine and hasn't been tampered with. And then there's a whole range of checks that are made of the client environment. I'll talk about that in a minute, to verify that that's the case. A token is returned from the Approov service based on policies that you set, and then that token is integrated with the request to the back end, and that's again the checking is done there to validate whether the Approov the token is acceptable or not. So there's a caching mechanism as well. So the check to the cloud can be every five minutes or so. And the key thing here is the service works together with the SDK and does the checking. So that's overall how it works. In terms of the integrity of the device, this is a very granular approach that we have, and it's updated as new threats emerge. But there are a whole range of things that can be detected in the environment. Obviously, whether something's been, the device is rooted or jailbroken is one of them, but it also checks for the presence of all sorts of frameworks and software. There are some cases where you may think that a rooted device is acceptable for your application, for example, if it's a gaming app. And so therefore, it's very important that you have a granular control over the policy that is defined. And that's something that we manage over the air. So you can modify that and it rolls out to all your applications. You don't need to modify the application code or update the app as you manage this. So attestation and device integrity are taken care of. And as I say, we keep this updated as new threats emerge. Another key thing we talked about was the channel integrity. And you need to be able to protect the channel. And the approach to that is to use certificate pinning. This can be complicated to do if you're doing this not in a dynamic way. So we implement a dynamic pinning approach, which again means that everything can be managed from the cloud, and the pins that you use can be administered over the air. And this, of course, eliminates any opportunity for things going wrong. And it means you can also rotate pins if, for example, third-party applications or third-party services you're using change. You can do that very quickly and dynamically. And it really reduces any kind of downside of applying this approach to protect the channel. And then finally, because we do this attestation of the environment and of the app, we can do something very unique with runtime secrets. So all of the API keys that you use to access third-party APIs or your own APIs, they need to be protected. And there's plenty of studies out there that show that they are not currently. People scan mobile apps and they find all sorts of secrets and API keys exposed. So you want to get them out of your app code, and we provide a way to do that, and again, in a very dynamic way. And the key piece of this is that keys can be stored in the cloud and delivered just in time to the application when they're needed, but only if the attestation checks pass. So it's another layer of security which really can protect your API keys and other secrets. And again, it's very dynamic. So, for example, if there is a breach of keys from somewhere, you can immediately rotate them. You don't need to update the app code. So this is another really kind of key piece in the puzzle, if you like, that protects your running app. So moving on, one of the other key things about any kind of security solution is keeping the DevOps team happy. So John, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. We've all probably seen a graphic similar to this. So application security is incorporated into all phases of the software development lifecycle, from planning to design and implementation. And this allows us to build secure applications from the start rather than to try and do a bunch of stuff at the end and push our app out the door, which is very, very stressful. I've been there before. You don't want to do that. So we believe in shifting left. We've adopted the shift left philosophy, and we believe that tooling must be easy to use, must be automated and automatable, must work with any existing CI/CD solution, with it, whether it's Jenkins, Azure DevOps, Bitbucket, GitLab. The list goes on and on. So as all these other, you might be doing some other vulnerability scanning or assessing a SaaS tool or some other thing, you can also be doing implementing a WAP and RASP and obfuscation. You could do all these things in parallel. Each piece is of critical importance, and so we believe we can fit into that very nicely, and have done so for several years. We're on-prem. You don't need to upload source code or binaries to enable preemptive. Protections are embedded directly in the app binaries. There's no additional hardware, software, libraries, or dependencies required. So yeah.
Okay. And then the second piece to this is, as you go further towards that respond and recover part, it's very important to know what you're going to do if things do go wrong, while, after the application is deployed. So obviously, we provide analytics and visibility to what's going on, and a full set of dashboards that gives you that real-time feedback. And then we've mentioned that the over-the-air management of things like security policies and certificates and API keys is absolutely critical, so that you can respond. So, the breaches from online repositories or cloud repositories are happening all the time. You need to be able to very quickly rotate certificates and API keys when something goes wrong, so that you can keep your service running. And the other key piece about this is, there are the security personnel and skill set is quite limited. So it's very important that you don't need a big security team to, tune and manage a security solution. So we take that very seriously, and we make sure that our product is very easy to administer. And in particular, it doesn't need any rules or tuning. It's not like a machine learning solution, or one with rules, like a WAF, for example. You really can just set this up, and it just works. It's very definitive in the answer of whether an environment is safe or not. So anyway, this is pretty important to think about the life cycle and how you're going to be managing these solutions in practice, and how that's going to work. Okay, so we're nearing the end here. We're going to talk just briefly in conclusion. We believe very strongly that your apps will be sideloaded and on alternate app stores, whether you like it or not. Whether you plan to use sideloaded apps or not, you should be prepared for different things trying to access your APIs, and people trying to mimic your application, if not directly copy and clone them. So you need to take control of your app security, and our solution jointly gives you that defense in-depth approach to protect your apps, protect your intellectual property, shield your apps, and protect your runtime apps and APIs. So, PreEmptive shields the app IP, and Approov can verify the integrity outside of app stores, and can protect the channels to the API. And so really, these trends are a huge opportunity, we think, for the industry. But it's very important that you take control of your security, and that's certainly the opportunity is there. There's plenty of ways to address this issue. So we both have free trials, both companies. So it's easy to get started. So feel free to contact us, and we can set you up very quick to get the solutions deployed and try them out. And we look forward to talking to you. So let's see, we move on. We've got a Q&A session here. Not sure whether there's any questions, John, for us. Not seeing any coming in. I mean, I had one. I wondered, how do you see the use of both of these solutions together? Maybe that's a question for you, John.
Yeah. I think the PreEmptive and Approov solutions, they complement each other very, very well. So basically, in practice, the way it works is you'll be developing. We compile our code, we'll sign a code, build our binaries, sign them, run the obfuscation, then we'll run Approov to get the appropriate checksums and certificates, and then publish. So most of the steps occur as post build, and it's several different steps. And I think we work just from a philosophical standpoint. We both hit the sweet spot between cost, convenience, functionality. Neither Approov nor PreEmptive require an army of consultants to implement. We're both very easy to use. We have quick starts. You can literally get up and running with PreEmptive and Approov within minutes. And then we both say, we were talking the other day, we both say, give it approximately one sprint to get it fully implemented and running as part of your CI/CD. And You know, so I think we're both very similar in that regard, and we complement each other very well in terms of what we're both trying to achieve.
There's a couple of questions here. So there's one which is probably, if you take a look at it, is the idea of apps being reverse engineerable is only true if no measures are taken to protect the application at the app level.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And a couple examples here given. So yeah, I mean, this is assuming we have not done anything to implement any sort of anti reverse engineering or decompilation or anti-disassembly in place. So, but by the nature of the environments and the tool chains, they can be reverse engineered. So if we don't do anything and we deploy our APK, then yes, we can decompile it. But if there is something in place, then yes, that will protect it.
Okay, then there's a question for me, I guess, which is, you know, does the Approov app level protection work offline? So as I mentioned, there's a 5-minute caching for the tokens, but we also have another solution for exactly that scenario. So the short answer is yes, but you'd have to, you know, talk to us about how that works. Something we had to put that in place for things like remote, well, people accessing apps in underground car parks and things like that for some use cases we had with protecting cars and you know, smart car access, if you like. So we have got an approach for that we can talk to you a little bit more about. And then one probably for you here, which is our iOS apps made for the DMA web. Are they encrypted? So I don't know the answer to that, John. I don't know whether you.
No, the encryption, the binary encryption is applied by the App Store itself by way of the Apple certificate specifically. So we cannot assume that the alternative app stores have any type of binary encryption applied or distributing on the web.
So another one is, will the product be available to individuals or only businesses? Yeah, so I mean that's kind of going into the user. We haven't talked much about the app users. Obviously, this is, you know, we need to make sure we protect the users of the apps and make it easy for them to report issues. I think that's kind of a little bit out of the scope of what we're doing. But that's certainly part of the, you know, the whole objective of the DMA is to provide more choice and you know, a better service for individuals who are accessing apps and services. Okay, I think we're actually over time, so we probably should finish here. Get in contact with us. We can set you up with a trial, and we can talk further about any issues you have with your apps. But thanks for attending today, and we appreciate your time. And I'm sure we'll talk later.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.